Hi, everyone. So, now I'm going to talk about what is often known as, in John Beebe's world, the trickster function, but what we call in socionics the vulnerable function, or the point of least resistance, or the blind spot. Lots of different names here. It's here, the vulnerable function, number 4 in our model. Now, when we're talking about the ego block, the valued strong part of ourselves, the superid block, the still valued but weak part of ourselves, and the id block, what we are actually quite strong at but don't value. Now we have what this block here, which I would call the superego block. And the superego block is a bit like Freud's superego, something which is sort of foisted upon us, something which we don't like, but we're also not very good at doing. That's the idea. It is something which is not valued, it's neglected, but it's also a place of weakness, not strength. And because it's something we don't value, we don't actually care about or want to have to do, right? We don't care for, but it's also something which we aren't very good at. That very much becomes a public thing rather than a private thing, hence is in the top 2 rows, right, rather than the bottom 2 rows. Top 2 rather than bottom 2. Well, essentially, why even have this thing? Why is it even there? Because it's the outside world which is putting it upon us. It's not something we would want to have anything to do if we could help it. But we have to, because we live in the world which has expectations and demands of us that we would rather not have ourselves. And as the point, it's very much a public thing. Whereas the ego block is what we are bringing to the world, right? The superego is what the world is then demanding of us, which we aren't very good at actually doing and would rather not have to do. So that's the idea of the superego block, right? And within the superego block, again, you've got 2 functions. One of them we'll cover in the next video, and the other one is the vulnerable function. As I said before, the earlier number in each block kind of sets the need. In leading and creative, the leading sets the need. It's very much the boss. The creative function follows that very well because the creative function is very professional, very collaborative, you could say. When it comes to the suggestive and mobilizing superid, the suggestive is meant to set what it needs to do, but it's a bit sort of, oh, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm not sure. So they're mobilizing, like, okay, I'll show you what you need to do. I'll show you how to fulfill whatever you need. I mean, it trips over itself and it also fails in doing so. Sometimes it gets better at what it does, and it's less likely to slip up and fail. But usually it's sort of, it's a bit sort of a comical, slip a banana in front of everyone laughs at you sort of thing. In this case, the ignoring, right, is saying, no, I'm having nothing to do with this. Don't use me. And the demonstrative is like, oh, I've got plenty of free time now. Might as well help out the creative. How about the creative, which basically it does. It sort of helps out the rest of the functions in the background without, setting much of a thing itself, because it doesn't actually care about anything itself. It just wants to sort of, it's an area to relax, able to fall back on. It's very much taken for granted, ticking away in the background, that sort of thing. Now, when it comes to the vulnerable function, or what's called the trickster function, this is receiving a need to fulfill. Right? It's not the thing which is setting the need; it's receiving it now, because it's the latter one in this block. But, and here's the key point: it is like the ignoring function, intransigent. And by being intransigent, in other words, by being stubborn but also neglected, it refuses to do what is asked of it. And that's the key thing about the vulnerable. It is very much an ultimate computer says no function. And while the ignoring, at least, if the dominant or leading function demands it and requires it, can actually come out of its box, out of its cage, and actually do what needs to be done, well, the vulnerable function does not. It's consistently off. It is very, very weak. It has very little energy directed towards it, as well as being weak. So it just does not really do anything. It does not act in that area at all. This is why I've said before, BB, well, not BB, but other four function models think you can get through the world by not using four of your functions, but I think it doesn't make any sense. You have to use more than four of your functions. But you can just about get by using seven out of your eight. And the one you don't use is the vulnerable. This is the non-used blind spot, you could say. And it is basically like a blind spot. You don't value it at all. You're not good at it at all. You don't recognize its need at all in this world. That is the idea of a vulnerable function. So it means it's a big gaping hole which you are not interested in filling, and everyone else can see as being your gaping hole, the thing you just don't do, the black hole in your soul, you could say. That is the vulnerable function. And so, whatever is demanded of you in that area, you will not fulfill, you will not do properly because you're not thinking about that. It's not something you see there being any need to do at all. So, that's why it's called a vulnerable function. It's not something which you feel pain in because you don't even notice it. It's almost numb. It's just sort of like bleh. You don't perceive any need for it at all. So it will create and cause problems for you because you're not attending to it. And that will lead to issues further down the line. If you start to feel pain, it's actually because the negligence you have it towards your vulnerable function can then lead to problems in terms of your suggestive function being deprived, or in terms of you not being able to actually fulfill the demands set by your leading function because this has sort of let things down, or your role needing to respond to a thing and letting it down. We'll talk about the role later, of course. But that's the idea. The pain is felt here, not actually here. This is a blind spot. It's just you're not thinking about this at all. So this takes me to the idea of a trickster function in John Beebe. This idea that there's this thing which sort of double binds you, and in double binding you, you start to sort of mess around with it. You start to mess with things, become more trickster-like. You could say it's a vague, strangely thought out idea. It doesn't really fit together and make sense. It's simpler to say this is a blind spot. And that's what we see. We see in, say, ENTPs a lack of the ability to formulate and acknowledge their personal value judgments towards people who they like, who they dislike. We see in the ISTJ with TI in the top and SE next a lack of extroverted intuition. It's a blind spot. They don't think outside of their experiences. They cannot consider alternative possibilities, what they've decided upon. This is what I mean. It's a blind spot. They don't see this. And so that can let you down. If you want to call this a trickster, it is the leg sticking out, which you're about to trip over because you're not seeing it or looking at it. And that's going to lead you to then damage the parts of yourself which are actually important to you. So yeah, that's perhaps how you could call it a trickster function. But I tend to call it the blind spot function. I think that describes it very well, or vulnerable function describes it very well. So I hope that helps. I will next describe, last but not least, the role function, or what BB calls the demonic function.